At my daughter's wedding, I overheard her tell her rich mother-in-law, "She's just a pathetic failure, nothing like you." So I stood up during toasts and played a message her deceased father had recorded before he died. The room fell completely silent. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. But let me back up and tell you how I got to that moment. My name is Dorothy Williams, though most people call me Dot. I'm 68 years old, and until 2 weeks ago, I thought my daughter Sarah respected me. I was wrong about a lot of things, it turns out. The wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of since she was 12 years old. The Ashford family estate in Connecticut, with its manicured gardens and mansion that looked like something from a movie. 200 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to stock a florist shop. Michael Ashford's family had money, the kind that goes back generations, and Sarah had landed exactly what she'd always wanted. I'd driven up from my small apartment in Hartford that morning, wearing the navy dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. It wasn't designer, but it was respectable. At least I thought it was until I saw the other guests. The women wore clothes that cost more than my monthly rent, diamonds that could blind you, and that particular look of confidence that comes with never having to check your bank balance. Sarah looked absolutely stunning in her grandmother's vintage Chanel dress that I'd carefully preserved for 40 years. The same dress I'd worn when I married her father, Frank, back when we thought love was enough to build a life on. She'd insisted on wearing it, and I was foolish enough to think it meant something sentimental to her. How naive I was. The ceremony was perfect, if you like that sort of thing. I sat in the second row, right behind Sarah's college roommate and her husband. Patricia Ashford, Michael's mother, sat in the front row wearing pearls that probably cost more than my car. She'd been politely cold to me since we met 8 months ago, the kind of coldness that comes wrapped in good manners, but cuts just as deep. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour, I was standing near the terrace doors when I heard Sarah's voice. She was talking to Patricia near the flower arrangements, probably thinking the music would cover their conversation. But I've always had excellent hearing, a blessing and a curse, as any mother will tell you. "Don't worry about her," Sarah was saying, glancing in my direction. "She's just a pathetic failure, nothing like you. She's never accomplished anything worthwhile. I mean, she worked at the public library for 30 years. Can you imagine anything more depressing?" Patricia nodded approvingly. "Well, at least she knows her place. Some people from simpler backgrounds can be so pushy about inserting themselves where they don't belong." My hand tightened around my champagne glass. Simpler backgrounds, as if dignity and hard work were something to be ashamed of. I thought about the double shifts I'd worked to put Sarah through college, the sacrifices Frank and I had made so she could have music lessons and summer camps, and all the opportunities we'd never had. That's when I remembered the letter in my purse. Frank had given it to me a week before he died, with strict instructions. "If Sarah ever treats you badly," he'd said, his voice weak but determined, "you read this out loud. Promise me, Dot. She needs to hear what I really thought about some things." I'd carried it with me ever since, never imagining I'd actually need to use it. But standing there, listening to my daughter describe me as a pathetic failure to a woman who saw me as beneath her notice, I realized Frank had seen something coming that I hadn't. He'd been watching Sarah change during his final months, and he hadn't liked what he was seeing. The reception dinner was a blur of forced smiles and small talk. I sat at table 8, strategically placed far enough from the head table to be out of sight, but close enough to not be obviously exiled. My dinner companions were distant relatives of Michael's family, who made polite conversation about the weather and the beautiful flowers while carefully avoiding any questions about what I did for a living. I picked at my salmon and watched Sarah work the room like the politician she'd always wanted to be. She'd graduated from Yale with a degree in public relations and now ran social media campaigns for wealthy clients. She was good at it, I had to admit. She knew exactly how to present herself, how to make people feel important, how to say all the right things. Tonight, she was the perfect bride, gracious and radiant, and everything a rich family would want in a daughter-in-law. But I knew the real Sarah, the one who'd called me crying when her rent was due in college, the one who'd moved back home for 8 months after a disastrous relationship in her 20s, the one who'd sat by Frank's bedside during his final weeks, holding his hand and promising to take care of me after he was gone, or so I'd thought. During the father-daughter dance, they played The Way You Look Tonight, Frank's favorite song. Sarah danced with Michael instead, since Frank wasn't there to twirl her around the dance floor one last time. I watched her smile and laugh, apparently unbothered by his absence. When the song ended, she didn't even glance toward the empty chair where I'd placed his photo. That's when I knew I had to read Frank's letter. Not to hurt Sarah, but to understand what had happened to the daughter I thought I knew. I slipped away during the dancing and found a quiet corner in the mansion's library. The Ashfords probably had more books than our entire town library, though I suspected most of them were for show. I pulled out the envelope Frank had given me, his handwriting shaky but still recognizable across the front. For Dorothy, only if you need it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Frank's careful script. The date at the top showed he'd written it just 3 days before he died. My dearest Dot, it began. If you're reading this, it means Sarah has shown you who she's become, not who she used to be. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know this will hurt, but you need to know what I observed during my final weeks. My heart was already racing, but I forced myself to keep reading. Sarah has been different since she started seeing Michael. Not just happy different, but calculated different. She's been asking questions about our finances, about my will, about what would happen to you after I'm gone. When I asked why, she said she was worried about your future. But I've been watching her, Dot, and I don't think worry is the right word. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the library. Yesterday, she brought me papers from something called Meadowbrook Manor, an assisted living facility. She said she'd been researching options for your future, places where you could be properly cared for after I died. She had brochures, pricing information, even a waiting list application. When I asked her why she thought you'd need assisted living at 68, she said it was just planning ahead. The letter continued for another page, each observation more devastating than the last. Frank describing Sarah's increasing impatience with his medical needs, her comments about how expensive my medications were becoming, her suggestions that perhaps I was getting too old to live alone safely. I changed my will, Dot. Everything goes to you now, with instructions that she can't contest. But more than that, I want you to know that the daughter we raised is still in there somewhere. She's just lost her way. Don't let her convince you that you're a burden. You're the best thing I ever did with my life, and if she can't see that, it's her loss. Not yours. The letter was signed simply, "Forever yours, Frank," with a postscript that made my hands shake. P.S. I saw the Meadowbrook Manor brochure in her purse again today. She's planning something, Dot. Don't let her do it. When I finished reading, I sat in that elegant library surrounded by books that probably cost more than most people's cars, and I finally understood why Frank had made me promise to use this letter, if I needed to. He'd spent his final days not just fighting cancer, but protecting me from a daughter who saw his death as an opportunity rather than a loss. I rejoined the reception with Frank's words echoing in my mind. His letter hadn't contained shocking revelations or complex investigations, just the careful observations of a dying man who'd noticed his daughter's growing coldness and selfishness. But those simple observations painted a picture that broke my heart. Sarah hadn't suddenly turned cruel. She'd been planning my future without consulting me, researching ways to have me declared incompetent or unsafe to live alone. Frank had seen it happening and tried to warn me the only way he could. I watched Sarah accept congratulations from the guests, her smile bright and practiced. But now I could see what Frank had noticed, the way she calculated each interaction, the slight impatience when someone took too long to make their point, the careful way she steered conversations away from anything that might reflect poorly on her new status. "Mrs. Williams?" A young man appeared at my elbow, one of Michael's cousins whose name I'd forgotten. "Michael wanted me to make sure you were enjoying yourself. Can I get you anything?" I smiled politely. "I'm fine, thank you. It's a beautiful wedding. The Ashford family certainly knows how to throw a party," he agreed, then lowered his voice. "Though, between you and me, it's nice to see Michael settling down with someone so practical. After some of the socialites he used to date, Sarah seems refreshingly down-to-earth. Practical. Down-to-earth. If only he knew what my down-to-earth daughter was planning for my immediate future." I thanked him and moved away, needing space to think. The irony was overwhelming. Here was Sarah, desperate to become part of high society, surrounded by people who appreciated her for the very qualities she was trying to shed. Her work ethic, her intelligence, her ability to connect with people, all things she'd learned growing up in a modest household with parents who valued character over status. But Frank's letter had revealed something else. Sarah wasn't just trying to fit in with the Ashfords. She was actively trying to distance herself from everything that reminded her of her origins, including me. I found myself studying the other guests with new eyes. The women Patricia's age moved through the crowd with the confidence of people who'd never doubted their place in the world. They had the kind of security that comes from generational wealth, from never having to worry about mortgage payments or whether you could afford to retire. That's what Sarah wanted. Not just money, but the peace of mind that comes with never having to think about money. And in her mind, taking care of an aging mother was a liability that threatened that security. The reception was winding down, but I knew the real evening was just beginning. Frank had given me more than just his observations about Sarah's plans. He'd given me permission to fight back if I needed to, and as I watched my daughter play her role as the perfect bride, I began to understand that I was going to need that permission. During the bouquet toss, Sarah looked directly at me and smiled. It was the first genuine attention she'd paid me all evening, and for a moment, I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe Frank had been wrong. Maybe his illness had made him suspicious of innocent behavior. Then I heard her conversation with Patricia as they stood near me afterward. "Thank goodness that tradition is over," Sarah said, adjusting her veil. "I was worried some desperate woman would knock you over trying to catch it." Patricia laughed. "Well, at least your mother didn't try. At her age, remarriage would be rather pathetic, don't you think?" "Oh, Mom's past all that," Sarah replied casually. "She's focusing on more age-appropriate activities now. Quiet hobbies, simple routines. It's probably better for her to accept the limitations that come with getting older." Limitations. At 68, I was supposed to accept limitations and fade quietly into the background while my daughter built her new life. Frank's letter suddenly felt like a lifeline rather than a burden. He'd seen this coming, and he'd tried to protect me the only way he could. I had a choice to make. I could continue being the gracious, unobtrusive mother who didn't embarrass her successful daughter, or I could remember that I was Dorothy Williams, a woman who'd raised a child, built a career, and supported a husband through cancer treatment, a woman who deserved better than being written off as a pathetic failure by her own daughter. The next morning, I drove back to Hartford with my mind clearer than it had been in months. Frank's letter had given me a different perspective on my recent conversations with Sarah, and I realized I needed to do some research of my own. My first stop was the public library where I'd worked for 30 years. "Dot!" Margaret hugged me warmly when I walked into the library Monday morning. "How was the wedding? I want to hear everything about this fancy family Sarah married into." I'd always liked Margaret's directness. She was 5 years younger than me, but had started working at the library the same week I did, fresh out of library school and full of energy. We'd been friends through raises and budget cuts, difficult patrons, and technology upgrades that left us both feeling ancient. "It was quite an experience," I said carefully. "Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something. I'm curious about assisted living facilities in Connecticut, particularly one called Meadowbrook Manor." Margaret raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. That was another thing I'd always appreciated about her. She understood that information was power, and sometimes you needed to gather it before you knew exactly how you'd use it. An hour later, we'd compiled quite a file from public records and online reviews. Meadowbrook Manor was indeed exclusive and expensive, but it had something else that caught my attention: a program for asset protection that allowed residents to sign over their estates in exchange for guaranteed lifetime care. More interesting was what we found in the online reviews. Several families had complained about high-pressure sales tactics, about feeling rushed into decisions during emotional periods following a spouse's death. The state had investigated the facility twice in the past 5 years for inappropriate marketing to vulnerable seniors. "Well," Margaret said, printing out the last of our research, "this place certainly seems aggressive about acquiring new residents, and their asset protection program looks designed to separate seniors from their money." I thanked Margaret and drove home with a box full of documents that painted a very different picture of Meadowbrook Manor than Sarah's brochures had suggested. But more than that, I had a plan forming in my mind. Frank's letter was just the beginning. What I needed now was to understand exactly what Sarah was planning and why. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called Sarah's college roommate, Jennifer, who'd been at the wedding and had always been more forthcoming than Sarah about family gossip. Under the guise of wanting to send a proper thank you note to the Ashfords, I asked some casual questions about the family's background. What I learned was enlightening. The Ashfords were indeed wealthy, but their money was relatively new. Michael's grandfather had made his fortune in manufacturing after World War II. Patricia had married into the family 30 years ago, and according to Jennifer's gossipy sources, she'd spent those decades carefully crafting their social position. "Sarah's so lucky," Jennifer confided. "Patricia's been taking her to all the right charity events, introducing her to the right people. She's already talking about getting Sarah onto some museum boards." After hanging up, I sat in my small apartment and thought about what I'd learned. Sarah wasn't just marrying into money. She was marrying into a social climbing project that had been going on for decades. And Patricia saw Sarah as a useful tool in that project. Someone young and educated and presentable enough to help maintain their position in Connecticut society. But that still didn't explain Sarah's plans for me, until I remembered something Frank had mentioned in his letter: Sarah's increasing impatience with the cost of things. My medications, my apartment rent, the small expenses that came with having an aging parent. I pulled out my checkbook and looked at the records from the past year. Sarah had been right about one thing. My expenses had increased. New medications for my arthritis, higher insurance premiums, the cost of having my apartment painted when the management company raised the rent. Nothing dramatic, but the kind of steady increase that comes with aging. Then I realized what Sarah was really afraid of. It wasn't that I needed assisted living now. It was that I might need expensive care in the future. And if I spent down my savings on long-term care, there would be nothing left for her to inherit. Frank's letter had been about protecting me from Sarah's immediate plans. But my own research had revealed something even more disturbing. My daughter saw me not as a person with needs and feelings, but as a financial liability that needed to be managed efficiently. That night, I made a decision that would have shocked the old Dorothy. I wasn't going to wait for Sarah to make the next move. I was going to find out exactly what she was planning, and then I was going to decide what to do about it. 2 weeks after the wedding, Sarah called to invite me to lunch. She sounded unusually warm and friendly, which immediately put me on alert. Sarah was never warm and friendly unless she wanted something, and after Frank's letter, I had a pretty good idea what that something might be. We met at a trendy bistro in West Hartford, the kind of place that served small portions on large plates and charged accordingly. Sarah looked radiant, still glowing from her honeymoon in Italy. She'd always photographed well, but marriage to Michael had given her a new confidence that was almost blinding. "Mom, you look tired," she said, kissing my cheek before we sat down. "Are you sleeping okay? Eating enough? I've been worried about you living alone in that little apartment." I ordered a salad and listened to her talk about the honeymoon, about Michael's family's vacation home in the Hamptons, about the charity boards Patricia was helping her join. It was like listening to someone describe a life from a magazine, all perfectly arranged details designed to impress. Finally, after we'd ordered coffee and dessert, Sarah got to the point. "Mom, Michael and I have been talking, and we're concerned about your future. That apartment you're renting is so small, and the neighborhood isn't getting any safer. We think it's time you considered moving somewhere more appropriate for someone your age." "Appropriate?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Well, secure, with medical services nearby. Maybe some social activities." Sarah smiled brightly. "Patricia knows about this wonderful senior community about an hour from our house. Very exclusive, very nice. The waiting list is usually years long, but they have a spot opening up next month." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "Senior community? Sarah, I'm perfectly capable of living independently." "Of course you are now, but it's about planning ahead. And honestly, it would give us all peace of mind to know you're somewhere safe." Sarah reached across the table and patted my hand. "The best part is, you wouldn't have to worry about finances anymore. They have a program where you can transfer your assets and they guarantee care for life." There it was, the asset protection program I'd researched with Margaret. Sarah wanted me to sign over my inheritance, my savings, everything Frank had left me, in exchange for a room in an institution where she could visit occasionally and feel virtuous about taking care of her mother. That's very thoughtful, I said slowly. But I'm not ready to make that kind of decision yet. I'm enjoying my independence. Sarah's smile tightened slightly. Mom, I understand that it's hard to admit when you might need help in the future. But Dad's been gone for 3 years now. You can't keep pretending you can handle everything on your own indefinitely. I'm not pretending anything. Sarah, I'm managing just fine. Are you? Sarah's voice took on a sharper edge. Because I've noticed you seem a bit scattered lately. Forgetting appointments, missing calls. Patricia mentioned that you seemed confused at the wedding, out of place. I felt a flash of anger. I seemed confused because I was listening to you call me a pathetic failure. That tends to be disorienting. Sarah blinked, clearly not expecting me to confront her so directly. I never said that. You told Patricia I was a pathetic failure who'd never accomplished anything worthwhile. You said working at the library for 30 years was depressing. I kept my voice level. I heard you, Sarah. That's not... You're taking things out of context. Sarah looked genuinely flustered for the first time. I was just trying to reassure her that you weren't going to be demanding or difficult. By calling me a failure? By explaining that you have realistic expectations about your place in our lives going forward. Sarah's mask was slipping, revealing the calculation underneath. Mom, this isn't about what you overheard. This is about being practical. You're 68 years old. You need to start planning for the future. I signaled for the check and started gathering my purse. Sarah, I am planning for the future. I'm planning to live my life on my own terms for as long as I'm able. And when you're not able, when you fall and break a hip, or have a stroke, or develop dementia, who do you think is going to take care of you? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the heart of it. Sarah wasn't worried about my current needs. She was terrified of my future needs. She wanted me safely warehoused where my aging wouldn't inconvenience her new life. I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, I said. But Sarah, when that time comes, I hope I'll still have a daughter who sees me as a person worth caring about, not just a problem to be solved. As I drove home, I thought about Frank's final gift to me. Not just the letter warning me about Sarah's plans, but the knowledge that he'd seen our daughter's transformation happening and had tried to protect me from it. Sarah thought she was maneuvering me into a corner. What she didn't realize was that she was actually revealing exactly how far she was willing to go to protect her new status. A month after Sarah's lunch invitation, she called again. This time, I could hear voices in the background, and the formal tone in her voice told me she was performing for an audience. Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over this evening? Michael and I have some family business to discuss with you. I agreed, though I suspected I knew exactly what kind of family business they had in mind. I spent the afternoon preparing, rereading Frank's letter, and making sure I understood exactly what I was walking into. Sarah and Michael's house in West Hartford was everything she'd always dreamed of. Colonial style, perfectly landscaped, in a neighborhood where the median income required 2 professional salaries and significant family money. Sarah had posted dozens of photos of it on social media, showcasing each room like a magazine spread. When I arrived, I found Sarah, Michael, and Patricia waiting in the formal living room. The staging was deliberate, with me seated alone on one side while the 3 of them faced me from the sofa. It felt like an intervention, which I supposed it was. Dorothy, Patricia began, her voice warm but authoritative. We wanted to talk to you about some concerns we've all been having. Sarah jumped in. Mom, you've seemed more forgetful lately. Missing appointments, not returning calls promptly. Small things, but they're adding up. Michael nodded gravely. We think you might be experiencing some early cognitive changes. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's something we need to address proactively. I listened to their carefully rehearsed presentation with growing understanding. They'd constructed a narrative about my declining mental health, but unlike the fabricated examples I might have expected, these were subtle distortions of normal behavior. The missed appointment had been rescheduled by me due to a conflict. The unreturned calls were from telemarketers and Sarah's friend Jennifer, not urgent communications. The good news, Patricia continued, is that we've been able to secure you a place at Meadowbrook Manor. They have an opening next week, and we can arrange the transition quickly. All you need to do is sign these papers, Michael said, pulling out a folder of documents. Power of attorney, asset transfer agreements, healthcare directives, everything to make the transition smooth and protect your interests. I looked at the three of them. These people who thought they could manipulate me into signing away my life with exaggerated concerns about my mental capacity. Sarah sat there nodding encouragingly, playing the role of the concerned daughter while planning to inherit everything her father had left me. This is quite a production, I said finally. How long have you been planning this intervention? Sarah's smile faltered slightly. Mom, this isn't a production. We're genuinely worried about you. Are you? I pulled out Frank's letter, the envelope worn from being carried in my purse for weeks. Because I have something I think you'll all find interesting. I unfolded the single sheet of paper and began to read aloud. Frank's careful observations about Sarah's questions concerning my finances, her research into assisted living facilities, her growing impatience with the costs of having an aging mother. She brought me papers from something called Meadowbrook Manor, I read. An assisted living facility. She said she'd been researching options for your future, places where you could be properly cared for after I died. Sarah went completely white. Michael frowned in confusion. Patricia's composed expression didn't change, but I saw her hands clench slightly in her lap. When I asked her why she thought you'd need assisted living at 68, she said it was just planning ahead, I continued. But I've been watching her, Dot, and I don't think planning is the right word. As Frank's letter continued, detailing his observations about Sarah's calculated approach to my future care, I watched my daughter's face cycle through shock, panic, and finally a cold calculation I'd never seen before. When I finished reading, the silence in the room was absolute. Then Michael spoke. Sarah, is this true? Were you researching assisted living facilities while your father was dying? That's when I realized this confrontation was just the beginning of something much larger. That letter proves nothing, Sarah said, but her voice shook. Dad was sick, probably confused. He was seeing problems that weren't there. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my purse. Your father was many things, Sarah, but confused wasn't one of them, especially not about something this important. Michael was studying the documents on the coffee table, the power of attorney forms, the asset transfer agreements, the Meadowbrook Manor paperwork. Sarah, when exactly did you start researching this place? I was just being prepared, Sarah said defensively. Someone had to think ahead about Mom's future needs. While your father was dying of cancer? Michael's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it I hadn't heard before. You were planning to move your mother into assisted living while he was fighting for his life? Patricia tried to intervene. Michael, I think we should focus on Dorothy's current situation rather than relitigating past decisions. Should we? I asked, turning to Patricia with interest. Because I did some research of my own after Sarah mentioned Meadowbrook Manor. Did you know they've been investigated twice by the state for aggressive marketing to vulnerable seniors? For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia looked genuinely uncomfortable. I'm sure any successful facility faces occasional regulatory reviews. Occasional reviews about pressuring grieving widows to sign over their assets immediately after their husbands' deaths. I pulled out the folder of public records Margaret had helped me compile, because that's what the state found. High-pressure tactics, rushed decision-making, families who felt manipulated into making permanent choices during temporary emotional crises. Sarah grabbed for the papers. Where did you get these? Public records, Sarah. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look. I kept the documents out of her reach. The State Licensing Board, consumer protection agencies, online review sites, all freely available to anyone who bothers to investigate before signing their life away. Michael was reading over my shoulder now. Jesus, look at these complaints. Felt pressured to decide immediately. High-pressure sales presentation. Regretted signing asset transfer agreement. Sarah, did you actually research this place, or did someone recommend it to you? The silence that followed was telling. Finally, Patricia spoke. I may have mentioned that they had an excellent reputation in certain circles. Certain circles being wealthy families looking to warehouse inconvenient relatives, I asked mildly. That's a terrible thing to say, Sarah snapped. We're trying to ensure you get proper care. No, you're trying to ensure I don't become a financial burden on your new lifestyle. I stood up, feeling calmer than I had in months. The difference is that proper care considers what I want, not just what's convenient for you. Michael was still studying the complaint documents. Mom, some of these families sued Meadowbrook. They accused the facility of elder abuse, of manipulating seniors into signing over assets they didn't understand. Patricia's composure was finally starting to crack. Those are isolated incidents. Every industry has a few bad actors. Are they? I asked. Because according to these records, Meadowbrook has a specific program targeting recent widows. They market to families during funeral planning, offer estate protection services, provide referrals through certain funeral homes and lawyers. I watched the three of them process this information. Sarah looked like she was going to be sick. Michael was angry, though I wasn't sure if it was directed at his wife or his mother. Patricia was calculating, probably trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Even if the facility has some problems, Sarah said desperately, that doesn't change the fact that you need to plan for your future. You can't live alone forever, Mom. Why not? I asked. I'm 68, not 88. I'm healthy, mentally sharp, and perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my living situation. But what if something happens? What if you fall, or get sick, or need help? Sarah's voice was rising. You can't expect us to drop everything and take care of you. There it was. The real fear, underneath all the concern about my welfare. Sarah wasn't worried about my current needs. She was terrified that my future needs might interfere with her carefully planned new life. I'm not expecting you to take care of me, Sarah. I'm expecting you to respect my right to make my own choices about how I want to live. Those choices affect other people, Patricia said sharply. Family decisions should be made collectively, considering everyone's interests. Everyone's interests, I repeated. And what exactly are your interests in this situation, Patricia? Patricia straightened in her chair, her social mask firmly back in place. My interest is in seeing this family function harmoniously. Sarah is my daughter-in-law now, and that makes her welfare my concern. And my welfare? Does that concern you at all? Of course it does, which is why we think Meadowbrook would be perfect for you. You'd have security, medical care nearby, social activities with people your own age. I had to admire her persistence. Even caught recommending a facility with a questionable reputation, she was still trying to sell me on the benefits of institutional living. Patricia, I said gently, I spent 30 years working at a public library. Do you know what that taught me? How to research things thoroughly, how to spot inconsistencies in people's stories, and how to help people find information they need to make good decisions. Michael looked up from the complaint documents. What kind of inconsistencies? Well, for instance, when someone recommends a specific facility they claim to have researched, but all their information comes from marketing materials rather than independent sources. I looked directly at Patricia. Or when someone is very eager to see a particular outcome, but can't explain why that outcome is important to them personally. Sarah tried to regain control of the conversation. Mom, you're being paranoid. We're trying to help you. Are you? Because help usually involves asking what the person wants, not telling them what they're going to do. I sat back down, feeling like I was finally getting somewhere. Sarah, in all these conversations about my future, have you ever asked me what I actually want? Of course, we want what's best for you. That's not what I asked. Have you asked me what I want? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Michael spoke. What do you want, Dorothy? I want to live in my own apartment for as long as I'm able. I want to make my own decisions about my health care, my finances, and my social life. I want to be treated like a competent adult, not a problem to be managed. I paused, looking at each of them, and I want my daughter to see me as a person worth respecting, not just an obligation to be discharged efficiently. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I do respect you. I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared something will happen to you, and I won't know how to handle it. For the first time all evening, I heard something genuine in her voice. Sarah, being scared is normal, but being scared doesn't justify trying to control someone else's life. I'm not trying to control your life. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From making my own mistakes? From living independently? From having the dignity of making my own choices? I reached across and took her hand. Sweetheart, I've been taking care of myself for 68 years. I raised you, I supported your father through cancer, I managed a library budget and staff. Why do you suddenly think I'm incapable of managing my own life? Michael was nodding slowly. She has a point, Sarah. Your mother seems pretty sharp to me. Patricia tried one more time. But the financial protections at Meadowbrook are designed to protect the facility's revenue stream, not the residents' interests, I interrupted. Patricia, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I can read financial documents, and I can spot a bad deal when I see one. Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin. So what happens now? You just go back to your apartment and pretend this never happened? I go back to my apartment and continue living my life. You go back to yours and stop trying to manage mine. I gathered my purse and stood up. And maybe, if you can learn to see me as an equal rather than a dependent, we can rebuild some kind of relationship. But what if you do need help someday? Sarah asked. Then I'll ask for it. And if you're willing to provide it respectfully, without trying to take over my life, maybe we can work something out. I paused at the door. But Sarah, if I ever need care, it will be my decision how to handle it. Not yours, not Patricia's, not some facility that sees me as a source of revenue. As I drove home, I realized that the evening had gone better than I'd expected. Frank's letter had given me the ammunition I needed, but my own research had given me something more valuable, the knowledge that I was right to resist their pressure. More importantly, I'd seen a glimpse of the real Sarah underneath all the calculation, a young woman who was genuinely scared of the responsibilities that came with having aging parents. 3 weeks later, Sarah called to ask if we could have coffee. Just the two of us, she said. No Michael, no Patricia, no agenda about my living situation. I was skeptical, but curious enough to agree. We met at a small cafe near the library, neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage. Sarah looked different, tired, less polished than usual. Her perfect composure had cracks in it that I'd never seen before. I've been thinking about what you said, she began without preamble, about not asking what you wanted, about treating you like a problem instead of a person. I waited, curious to see where this was going. I talked to a therapist about it, about why I was so fixated on getting you into that place. Sarah's hands were wrapped around her coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself. She asked me when I started being afraid of you getting older. And when Dad got sick, when I realized that loving someone doesn't protect them from aging or dying or needing help, tears started forming in her eyes. I watched you take care of him, and I thought about how someday someone would have to take care of you. And I panicked. This was more honesty than I'd heard from Sarah in years. Why did that scare you so much? Because I didn't think I could do it. I didn't think I was strong enough or patient enough or good enough to take care of you the way you took care of him. Her voice broke completely, so I convinced myself that the solution was to find someone else to do it. Someone professional, someone better at caregiving than me. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. Sarah, no one expects you to be a professional caregiver. But what if you need help? Real help, not just emotional support? She looked up at me with eyes that seemed much younger than her 32 years. What if you get sick like Dad did? Then we'll figure it out together. But that doesn't mean signing over my independence now just because something might happen later. I know that now. The therapist explained the difference between planning for possible futures and trying to control them. Sarah wiped her eyes with her napkin. She also pointed out that I was treating you like you were already incapacitated, instead of like someone who could participate in planning for her own future. We sat in silence for several minutes. I thought about Frank's letter, about the daughter he'd been trying to protect me from, but I could also see the daughter he'd raised. Scared, imperfect, but capable of growth. What about Patricia? I asked. And Michael? Michael was horrified when he really understood what we were planning. He said it reminded him of the way his grandfather's business partners tried to pressure him into selling the company when he got dementia. Sarah managed a weak smile. Apparently, the Ashford family has some experience with people trying to take advantage of vulnerable seniors. And Patricia? Patricia. She's convinced this whole thing got blown out of proportion, that we should have just handled the Dorothy situation more quietly. Sarah looked embarrassed. She actually said that. The Dorothy situation. I had to laugh. Well, at least she's consistent. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for calling you a failure, for trying to warehouse you, for treating you like a burden instead of my mother. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. I don't know if I can be the daughter you deserve, but I'd like to try. You don't have to be perfect, Sarah. You just have to see me as a person. I squeezed her hand. And maybe ask my opinion before making major decisions about my life. Deal. But Mom, if you ever do need help, real help, not just the normal stuff that comes with aging, will you tell me? Will you let me be part of the solution instead of shutting me out? I considered this carefully. The old Dorothy would have promised to handle everything herself, to never be a burden. But Frank's letter had taught me something about the cost of protecting people from difficult truths. I'll tell you, I said finally. But Sarah, being part of the solution means respecting my choices, even if they're not the choices you would make. I understand. As we prepared to leave, Sarah hesitated. Mom, there's something else. About Dad's letter. I tensed, wondering if she was going to challenge its authenticity or accuse me of manipulating his words. I'm glad he wrote it. Not because of what it said about me, but because it meant he was still protecting you even after he was gone. Her voice was soft. I hope someday I'll be smart enough to love someone that completely. Driving home, I realized that the woman I'd raised was still there underneath all the fear and calculation. It was going to take time to rebuild our relationship, and it would never be the same as it was before. But maybe, with enough honesty and patience, it could be something better. 6 months later, I was reading in my favorite chair when my phone rang. It was Sarah calling with what had become our weekly check-in. Not to manage my life or push me toward any particular decision, but just to talk. How was your week? She asked, and I could hear genuine interest in her voice. Good. I had lunch with Margaret, went to the book club at the library, started reading that novel you recommended. I settled back in my chair. Robert and I went to a concert on Saturday. There was a pause. Robert was still a relatively new development in my life. A retired English professor I'd met at the library's lecture series. We'd been seeing each other for 3 months, taking things slowly and enjoying each other's company. How are things going with him? Sarah asked carefully. Very well. He's intelligent, kind, and he treats me like an adult capable of making my own decisions. I smiled, knowing Sarah would catch the reference to our earlier conversations. Amazing how refreshing that can be. I deserved that, Sarah laughed. But seriously, I'm glad you're happy. You deserve someone who appreciates you. This was still new territory for us, Sarah showing genuine interest in my happiness rather than just my welfare. The therapy was helping, but more than that, she seemed to be discovering that having a mother with an independent life was actually more interesting than having one who existed solely to be managed. Speaking of appreciation, I said, how are things with Michael and Patricia? Michael's good. He's been asking more questions about my family, about you and Dad. I think meeting you made him realize that not all mothers-in-law are like his mother. Sarah's voice got quieter. Patricia is adjusting. She's stopped mentioning assisted living facilities at least. That's progress. She asked me last week if you were still harboring resentment about the Meadowbrook situation. I told her that you weren't harboring anything. You'd simply learned to be more careful about trusting her judgment. I laughed. I bet that went over well. About as well as you'd expect. But Michael backed me up, which was good. He pointed out that trust has to be earned back after it's been broken. We talked for another 20 minutes about books, about Sarah's work, about Robert's grandchildren and their upcoming visit. Normal family conversation, the kind we hadn't had in years. When we hung up, I realized how much I'd missed this version of my daughter. The next morning, I was surprised to get a call from Michael. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I wanted to ask you something. Of course. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about what happened last year with the whole Meadowbrook situation. I realize I didn't handle it very well. I let my mother push an agenda that wasn't in your best interests. I waited, curious where this was going. I wanted you to know that Sarah and I have talked about it extensively. We've agreed that any future decisions about family matters will include you as an equal participant, not just someone whose life gets planned by other people. I appreciate that, Michael. There's something else. Sarah mentioned that you might be interested in traveling more. Now that you're not worried about us pressuring you into assisted living. This was news to me. She did? She said you'd always wanted to see Ireland but never had the chance. Patricia and I are planning a family trip to Europe next spring, and we'd like you to join us as our guest. I was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected invitation. That's very generous, Michael, but before you say no, let me explain. It wouldn't be a family obligation trip where you'd have to keep up with our schedule or pretend to enjoy activities you don't like. We'd plan some things together, but you'd have plenty of independence to explore on your own. And Patricia is on board with this? Michael laughed. Patricia suggested it, actually. I think she's finally figured out that having a happy, independent mother-in-law reflects better on the family than having one who feels pushed around and resentful. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in the past year. 12 months ago, Sarah had been planning to put me in an institution and take control of my assets. Now she was encouraging me to travel internationally and including me in family plans as an equal participant. The difference wasn't just in Sarah's attitude, it was in my own willingness to stand up for myself. Frank's letter had given me permission to fight back, but the real change had come from recognizing my own worth and refusing to accept treatment that diminished it. A year later, I was packing for Ireland when Sarah arrived at my apartment with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. "Excited about tomorrow?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my sofa. "Nervous and excited," I admitted. "It's been a long time since I traveled anywhere more exotic than Hartford. You're going to love it. And Mom, I'm really glad you said yes to the trip." I looked up from folding sweaters. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Can I ask you? Last year, when you were so determined to get me into Meadowbrook, were you really worried about my safety? Or were you more worried about the inconvenience of having an aging parent?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, both. I was scared something would happen to you, but I was also scared of how that would affect my life with Michael. I wanted the peace of mind that comes with knowing someone else was handling the hard stuff. And now? Now I realize that the hard stuff is part of loving someone. You can't just outsource the difficult parts of relationships and expect the good parts to remain meaningful." She smiled. "Besides, you've proven pretty conclusively that you don't need to be handled by anyone." I laughed, thinking about everything that had led us to this point. Frank's letter warning me about Sarah's plans, my research into Meadowbrook Manor, the confrontation in Sarah's living room where I'd finally stood up for myself, the months of therapy and honest conversations that had followed. "You know what your father would say about all this?" I asked. "What?" "He'd say the best gift he ever gave me wasn't the letter warning me about your plans. It was teaching me that I was worth fighting for." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I think he'd be proud of both of us. You for standing up for yourself, and me for finally learning to see you as a person instead of a problem." "He'd definitely be proud," I agreed, "and probably relieved that he doesn't have to haunt Patricia for recommending questionable senior living facilities." We both laughed at that image. Patricia had indeed adjusted her approach to our family dynamics, though I suspected it was more about maintaining her social position than any genuine change of heart. But that was fine with me. I didn't need Patricia to love me. I just needed her to respect my autonomy. "Mom, there's something I want to say before you leave for Ireland." I stopped packing and gave her my full attention. "Thank you for not giving up on me. When you played Dad's letter that night, you could have just exposed what I was planning and walked away. You could have written me off as a selfish daughter who didn't deserve a relationship with you." "I thought about it," I said honestly. "But you didn't. You gave me the chance to understand what I'd become and choose to be better." "Not everyone would have done that." I sat down next to her on the sofa. "Sarah, you're my daughter. Not because you're perfect, but because we're family. Real family doesn't disappear when people make mistakes. It just requires everyone to work harder at being honest with each other. I love you, Mom, not for what you can do for me or what you represent in my life, but because you're Dorothy Williams, a woman who worked for 30 years at a job she loved, who raised a difficult daughter with patience and grace, and who had the courage to fight for her own dignity when everyone around her was trying to take it away." As we hugged goodbye, I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the pain of hearing my daughter call me a pathetic failure, the fear of losing my independence to someone else's convenience, the discovery that I was stronger and more valuable than I'd allowed myself to believe. Frank's letter had started it all, but the real victory had been learning to see myself the way he'd always seen me, as a person worth respecting, worth fighting for, worth loving exactly as I was. Tomorrow, I'd board a plane for Ireland, not as a burden being managed by my family, but as Dorothy Williams, a 69-year-old woman, embarking on an adventure she'd dreamed about for decades. Some victories don't come with fanfare or celebration. Sometimes the greatest triumph is simply the quiet satisfaction of knowing you refused to disappear when everyone around you was trying to make you invisible. And that, I thought as I finished packing, was exactly the kind of legacy Frank would have wanted me to create. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. The champagne was still cold in my hand when my phone rang, shattering what should have been the most peaceful moment of my life. My son's voice dripped with the kind of entitlement that comes from never having worked a day for anything. 24 hours later, I was standing in my own foyer, watching a parade of strangers track sand across my Italian marble floors like they owned the place. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up to how this delicious mess started. 3 months ago, I sold Sterling Marketing Solutions, the company I'd built from nothing over 30 years. The buyers paid $2.8 million cash, and after taxes, I had enough to do exactly what I wanted: buy my dream beach house and disappear from the corporate rat race forever. The house was everything I'd fantasized about during those brutal 18-hour workdays. 6,000 square feet of weathered cedar and glass perched on the dunes of the Outer Banks, with panoramic ocean views and enough space to host my entire extended family for the holidays I'd been too busy to enjoy for decades. I'd been there exactly 8 hours when Brandon called. "No congratulations on your retirement, Mom," or "The house looks amazing." Just straight to business. "Mom, we need you to move to the guest room upstairs. Melissa's entire family is flying in tomorrow for a 2-week vacation. Her parents, her sister's family, her brother and his girlfriend. That's 11 people total." I actually laughed. "Brandon, honey, this is my house. If you want to vacation here, we can work out some dates." "No, you don't understand. We already booked their flights. They're expecting to stay in the master suite and the main bedrooms. The guest room has a perfectly good ocean view. You'll be fine up there." The casual assumption that I'd just comply left me momentarily speechless. This was the same son I'd put through business school, whose failed restaurant I'd bailed out twice, whose mortgage I'd helped with when his graphic design company nearly folded. "Brandon, I bought this house to relax and enjoy my retirement. I'm not running a hotel for Melissa's family." His voice turned cold in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of his father during our divorce negotiations. "Look, Mom, you've got this huge house all to yourself. It's selfish. And if you don't want to be reasonable about sharing it, well, I heard there's a very nice assisted living facility just down the coastal highway." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. My 35-year-old son was essentially telling me to accommodate his in-laws or face abandonment. Again. "I see," I said quietly. "And what if I refuse? Then I guess we'll have to reconsider how much help you actually need at your age. Living alone in such a big house, managing all that space. Maybe it's too much responsibility for someone in their mid-60s. After I hung up, I sat on my new deck watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of amber and gold. The beauty should have been healing, but all I could think about was the satisfied smugness in Brandon's voice. He thought he'd cornered me, thought I was just another helpless old woman who'd caved to emotional blackmail. What Brandon didn't know, what I'd learned in 30 years of business, was that the best victories come from letting your opponent think they've already won. The next morning, I started preparing for their arrival, but not in the way they expected. I woke up to the sound of car doors slamming and voices carrying across the morning air. Apparently, Melissa's family had decided to arrive at 7 a.m. without warning, because why would they consider that the homeowner might want advance notice? From my upstairs window, I watched a caravan of rental cars disgorge what looked like a small army. Melissa directed traffic like a general deploying troops, pointing toward different entrances and barking orders about luggage distribution. Her parents emerged from the first car, both wearing those aggressively casual vacation outfits that scream, "We're here to be served." What struck me most was how comfortable they all seemed. No hesitation, No glances toward the house, wondering if they should knock first. They moved like people who'd been told this was their space now. I slipped on my robe and headed downstairs, curious to see how they'd handle actually encountering the homeowner. "Oh!" Melissa startled when she saw me, then quickly recovered. "Eleanor! Brandon said you'd moved upstairs already." "Good. The master suite gets the best morning light, and Mom has arthritis, so she really needs the ground floor bedroom." Her parents swept past me without introduction, wheeling their suitcases toward my bedroom like they were checking into a resort. Melissa's sister Rachel and her husband corralled their 2 teenagers toward the guest bedrooms on the 2nd floor, while brother Kevin and his girlfriend claimed the den with the pull-out sofa. "Coffee's in the kitchen," I said mildly. "Help yourselves." "Oh, we brought our own supplies," Melissa chirped, opening my pantry and beginning to rearrange my carefully organized shelves. "Mom's on a special diet and the kids are picky eaters. We'll just need you to clear out some refrigerator space." I watched her pile my groceries into a cardboard box like she was cleaning out an employee's desk. The audacity was almost impressive. Almost. "Where would you like me to put these?" I asked, holding up my displaced food. "The garage refrigerator should be fine. Brandon said you had one out there." Of course, Brandon had given them a complete inventory of my property. I wondered what else he'd shared during their planning sessions. By noon, my house had been completely transformed. Pool toys littered the deck, wet towels draped over my antique furniture, and the kitchen looked like a hurricane had hit it. Melissa's mother held court at my dining table, complaining loudly about the water pressure in her shower while her husband critiqued my cable channel selection. "Eleanor," Melissa's father called out, "we're going to need the Wi-Fi password. And do you have any of those little drink umbrellas? The kids are making tropical smoothies." The casual expectation that I'd serve as their personal concierge was breathtaking. But I just smiled and provided the password, then excused myself to the garage, where I spent the afternoon making phone calls that would change everything. The first call was to my attorney, Sarah Chen, who'd handled the house purchase. "Sarah, I need you to pull the deed on the Outer Banks property. Specifically, I need to confirm the exact legal ownership structure." The second call was to my accountant, who'd structured the house purchase for optimal tax benefits. "Jim, remember how we set up the beach house purchase? Walk me through the ownership details again." The third call was to a local investigator I'd used during some messy corporate acquisitions. "Mike, I need a background check run on some house guests. Full financial workup, employment history, social media deep dive. Yes, I'll pay your rush fee." By dinner time, while Melissa's clan devoured steaks they'd helped themselves to from my freezer, I had all the information I needed. But I wasn't ready to play my cards yet. Better to let them get truly comfortable first. That night, as I lay in the small guest room listening to 11 people enjoy my house below me, I smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring the first surprise. I woke up to find my coffee maker occupied by a line of Melissa's relatives, treating my kitchen like a hotel breakfast buffet. Her mother, Patricia, had taken over my entire counter space to prepare what appeared to be a gluten-free, dairy-free, joy-free feast for her various dietary restrictions. "Oh, Eleanor," she said without looking up, "we're going to need you to run to the store. Kevin's girlfriend is lactose intolerant, and Rachel's youngest is allergic to literally everything." I made a list. She handed me a 3-page shopping list written in the demanding scrawl of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Items like organic coconut milk, the expensive kind, not that watery stuff, and gluten-free bread that doesn't taste like cardboard, good luck, were highlighted in different colors according to urgency. The casual assumption that I'd become their unpaid grocery service was remarkable even by my family's standards, but instead of arguing, I took the list and headed for town. What they didn't know was that I had my own errands to run. My first stop was the hardware store, where I purchased several items that would prove useful later. Next, I visited the local phone company to discuss some changes to my service plan. Then a quick trip to my bank, where I had a fascinating conversation with the manager about account security features. By the time I returned with their groceries, Melissa's crew had made themselves even more at home. Kevin had rearranged my living room furniture to optimize TV viewing, while Rachel's kids had discovered my art supplies and were creating masterpieces on my dining room walls. "Oh, good. You're back," Melissa said, not bothering to help with the bags. "We're planning a big barbecue tomorrow night. About 30 people. Brandon's friends, some locals we've met, a few business contacts. You'll need to get steaks, hamburgers, hot dogs, all the sides. I sent you a text with the details. 30 people. In my house. Without my permission. That sounds like quite a party, I said evenly. It's going to be amazing. We're really going to put this place on the map. Brandon said you never entertained much, so it's probably good to get some real use out of this kitchen. I noticed she'd already started moving my personal items out of the common areas. Family photos, my books, even my mother's antique vase had been temporarily relocated to make room for their vacation aesthetic. That evening, while they planned their party from my deck chairs, I made another round of phone calls from the garage. This time to some old business contacts who owed me favors. Big favors. Tom, it's Eleanor Sterling. Yes, I know I'm retired, but I need a small favor. How quickly can your catering company handle a last-minute event? 30 people, tomorrow night. Money's no object, but there's a catch. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Melissa's family prepared for their grand party. They'd invited half the beach community, promising premium steaks and top-shelf liquor in my house. Patricia spent the morning criticizing my kitchen organization while simultaneously taking over every surface for party prep. Around noon, I heard Brandon's voice from the driveway and went to the window. He'd arrived with even more guests, college friends who'd apparently been promised a weekend at the family beach house. The casual way he distributed my spare keys to people I'd never met was particularly impressive. "Mom," he called out when he saw me. "There you are. Hope you're ready for a real party. We've got some important people coming tonight. Business networking, you know? This house is perfect for making connections. Important people. In my house, for Brandon's networking opportunities." The irony was delicious. I spent the afternoon on the deck, reading and watching their preparations with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a primitive tribe. They'd completely taken over, transforming my peaceful retreat into party central, never once asking if I minded having my home invaded by strangers. Around 5 p.m., I excused myself to get ready for the evening. After all, I wouldn't want to miss their big party. What they didn't know was that I'd prepared a few surprises of my own. By 6 p.m., cars lined my driveway like a luxury dealership showcase. Mercedes, BMWs, and Range Rovers belonging to the important people Brandon had invited to network at his mother's expense. I watched from my upstairs window as strangers wandered through my garden, helped themselves to drinks from my bar, and settled into my furniture like they owned it. Melissa had outdone herself with the decorations, creating what she called beach house chic by rearranging 30 years' worth of my collected treasures. My grandmother's quilts were now casual throw blankets. My award plaques had been tucked away as too corporate, and she'd actually moved my personal photographs to the closet so they wouldn't clutter the aesthetic. The final insult came when I saw Brandon giving someone a tour, describing the house as the family property, and casually mentioning that he was handling all the management decisions now that I was getting on in years. At 64, I chose my outfit carefully for the evening, a simple black dress that had served me well during hostile corporate takeovers. If you're going to deliver devastating news, you might as well look good doing it. The party was in full swing when I made my entrance. Brandon held court on the deck, regaling his audience with stories about acquiring the beach house and his plans for maximizing the property's potential. Melissa flitted between groups, playing hostess with impressive confidence for someone who'd never paid a dime toward the mortgage. "Eleanor," Patricia spotted me first, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for inconvenient elderly relatives. "There you are, dear. Could you check on the appetizers? I think they're running low." Of course, even at my own party, I was expected to serve as kitchen staff. Instead, I walked to the center of the deck and raised my voice just enough to catch everyone's attention. "Excuse me, everyone. If I could have just a moment?" The conversations gradually died as 30-plus strangers turned to look at the woman they'd been told was just the aging mother who came with the house. "I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate with us tonight. It's wonderful to see so many new faces enjoying this beautiful property." Brandon beamed, clearly pleased that his mother was finally embracing her role as gracious hostess to his networking event. "Before we continue," I said, pulling out my phone, "I have a few quick announcements." That's when the catering truck pulled into my driveway. Not the small, discreet catering company you might expect for a beach barbecue. This was Tom Morrison's premium event services, complete with uniformed staff, a full mobile kitchen, and enough equipment to service a corporate gala. "What's that?" Melissa asked, her hostess' smile faltering slightly. "Oh, that's dinner," I said cheerfully. "I thought since we were having such a large party, we should do it right. Prime rib, lobster tails, champagne service, the works." Brandon's expression shifted from pleased to confused to worried in the span of 10 seconds. Premium catering for 30 people wasn't cheap, and he was apparently doing math in his head. "Mom, we already bought steaks." "Oh, don't worry about those. We'll save them for another time." I turned to address the crowd again. "The catering staff will be setting up shortly, so if everyone could just give them some space to work." Tom Morrison himself approached, clipboard in hand and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that comes from being paid double his usual rate for a rush job. "Ms. Sterling, where would you like the champagne station?" "The champagne station?" Brandon's voice cracked slightly. "Right by the pool, Tom, and make sure everyone gets the good stuff. Dom Perignon, not the house champagne." I could feel the crowd's energy shift from casual party to something more expensive. These were people who recognized quality when they heard it, and Dom Perignon was definitely not backyard barbecue fare. The catering staff moved with military precision, transforming my deck into an elegant dining area complete with linens, crystal, and silver service. Within 30 minutes, what had been a casual cookout became a high-end dinner party with a price tag that would make most people's mortgage payments look reasonable. "Mom?" Brandon pulled me aside, his networking smile replaced by panic. "What's this going to cost?" I smiled sweetly. "Don't worry, honey. It's all taken care of." What I didn't tell him was exactly how it was being taken care of. That revelation would come later. For now, I was content to watch 30 strangers enjoy a $15,000 dinner party while my son slowly realized he might not be as in control of the situation as he'd thought. The morning after the party brought a reckoning that was almost worth the champagne hangover. I found Brandon and Melissa huddled over their phones at my dining table, frantically calling credit card companies and checking bank balances while surrounded by the remnants of last night's extravaganza. Empty Dom Perignon bottles lined the counter like expensive soldiers, while the catering bill, which I'd left conveniently on the kitchen island, created a paper trail of fiscal reality that had apparently sobered them both considerably. $15,000, Melissa whispered, staring at the invoice like it might spontaneously combust. For one dinner party. Brandon was on his third phone call to his bank, trying to explain why he needed his credit limit raised by exactly $15,000. The conversations weren't going well. "Good morning," I said brightly, pouring myself coffee from the expensive machine they'd commandeered 3 days ago. "How's everyone feeling after the big party?" "Mom, we need to talk." Brandon's voice had the strained quality of a man watching his financial future circle the drain. "About that catering bill." "Oh, wasn't it wonderful? Everyone raved about the lobster. Tom Morrison really outdid himself." "We can't afford $15,000 for one dinner party." I tilted my head thoughtfully. "That's strange. I was under the impression you were handling all the management decisions for this property now. At least, that's what you told all those nice people last night." The color drained from his face as the implications sank in. If he'd publicly claimed management responsibility for the house, then logically he'd be responsible for its expenses as well. "But Mom, I never actually said." "Oh, but you did. Several people mentioned how impressive it was that someone your age had acquired such a beautiful property and was managing it so professionally." I took a sip of coffee, savoring both the blend and the moment. "They were particularly interested in your business model. Using family assets for networking events was quite innovative." Melissa's mother, Patricia, chose that moment to emerge from my master bedroom, wearing my robe and carrying my favorite coffee mug. "Eleanor, dear, we're going to need fresh towels. And the Wi-Fi is running slowly. Can you call someone about that?" The casual entitlement was breathtaking, even after 3 days of constant examples. But before I could respond, my phone rang. "Eleanor Sterling, this is Janet Morrison from Coastal Properties Real Estate. I have some questions about the beach house listing." "Beach house listing?" I put the call on speaker, curious where this would lead. I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but I haven't listed any property for sale. Oh, that's odd. We received an inquiry yesterday from a Brandon Sterling claiming to represent the owner for a potential sale. He provided detailed information about the property and mentioned he was authorized to handle all real estate decisions. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ocean waves through the open windows. Brandon's face had gone from worried to pure panic, while Melissa stared at him like he'd suddenly sprouted a second head. I see, I said calmly. Well, Mr. Sterling is not authorized to represent me in any real estate matters. If someone has been providing information about my property without permission, that's quite concerning. Should I file a report with the local authorities? Impersonating a property owner is a serious matter. Brandon was making frantic no gestures, but I pretended not to notice. Let me think about that and get back to you, Mrs. Morrison. Thank you for calling. After I hung up, the silence stretched until Patricia, oblivious to the tension, piped up again. Eleanor, about those towels. Get out. The words came out quiet, but clear as crystal. Excuse me? I said get out, all of you. Pack your things and leave my house. Brandon found his voice. Mom, you can't be serious. We're family. Family doesn't impersonate each other to real estate agents. Family doesn't throw $15,000 parties on someone else's credit. And family certainly doesn't threaten nursing homes when they don't get their way. I walked to the front door and held it open. You have 2 hours to collect your belongings and leave. If you're not gone by then, I'll be calling both the police and Mrs. Morrison back to file those reports. What happened next would teach them more about family than they'd apparently learned in their entire lives. The exodus began immediately, but not in the organized fashion you might expect from people who'd spent 4 days treating my home like their personal resort. Instead, it devolved into a chaotic scramble of accusations, blame-shifting, and desperate negotiations that would have been comical if it weren't so pathetic. Patricia emerged from my master bedroom, dragging her suitcase and muttering about ungrateful hosts and false advertising. Kevin's girlfriend loudly complained about having to cut their vacation short because of my unreasonable demands. Rachel's teenagers actually seemed relieved. Apparently, sharing space with so many adults hadn't been their idea of a good time either. But it was Brandon's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of apologizing or attempting to make amends, he doubled down on his entitlement. You're making a huge mistake, Mom. Do you know who some of those people were last night? I was building valuable business relationships, networks that could benefit the whole family. The whole family? I raised an eyebrow. You mean the family you threatened to dump in a nursing home if I didn't comply with your demands? Melissa tried a different approach, switching to her most manipulative voice. Eleanor, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. Maybe we can work something out. Split the house time? Shared expenses? Shared expenses? I almost laughed. Like the $15,000 you can't afford to pay? Or the groceries I bought for your family's special diets? Or perhaps the utility bills that tripled when 11 people moved in? That's when Brandon played what he clearly thought was his ace card. Fine, but you're going to regret this. You think you can just live in this huge house all alone? At your age, what happens when you fall? When you can't manage the upkeep? You're going to need family, and we won't be there. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and I could see him thinking he'd won. That he'd successfully backed me into a corner with the specter of elderly helplessness and isolation. What Brandon didn't realize was that he'd just handed me the perfect opportunity to deliver the piece de resistance. You know what, Brandon? You're absolutely right. I can't manage this house alone. It's far too much responsibility for someone my age. His expression shifted to smug satisfaction. So you'll reconsider, which is why I sold it. The words dropped like a bomb in the sudden silence. Brandon's mouth actually fell open, while Melissa froze halfway through folding a beach towel. What do you mean, sold it? Patricia demanded. I walked to my desk and retrieved a folder I'd been keeping for just this moment. I sold it. Yesterday morning, as a matter of fact. All cash offer, quick closing. Very convenient timing. But you can't have sold it. We're staying here. We have plans. Had plans, I corrected gently. The new owners take possession next week. Professional property managers from Chicago. Lovely people. They plan to rent it out to carefully screened families who appreciate peace and quiet. Of course, This wasn't entirely true. What I'd actually done was transfer the property into an LLC I controlled, with management handled by a company that specialized in high-end vacation rentals. But the effect was the same. Brandon and his entitled family were no longer welcome, and there was nothing they could do about it. "You can't do this!" Brandon's voice cracked with desperation. "This is our family home." "No! Brandon, this was my retirement home. The home you told me I was too old to manage alone. The home you threatened to take away from me if I didn't submit to your demands." I closed the folder with a satisfying snap. "You were right about one thing, though. I do need family I can count on. I just realized you're not it." The final 20 minutes of their departure played out in a blur of slamming car doors and muttered threats about lawyers and family loyalty. But as the last rental car disappeared down my driveway, something interesting happened. My phone rang. "Ms. Sterling, this is David Chen from Outer Banks Property Management. We wanted to confirm that the Sterling Beach House is ready for its first rental guests. They arrive tomorrow for a 2-week stay. Payment has been received in full." I smiled, looking out at the ocean that was mine to enjoy again. "Yes, Mr. Chen. Everything's ready. I think you'll find our guests will be much more appreciative than the last group. After all, the best revenge isn't just success, it's profitable success." But this story was far from over. In fact, the real surprises were just beginning. The new renters arrived exactly as scheduled. The Patterson family from Richmond, a soft-spoken couple with 2 well-behaved teenage daughters who spent their first hour apologizing for disturbing me and asking permission to use the pool. The contrast with my recent house guests was so stark, it would have been funny if it weren't so refreshing. "Mrs. Sterling," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "we want to make sure we're not imposing. The property management company said you live on site." "I have a small apartment above the garage," I lied smoothly. What they didn't need to know was that I'd simply moved back into my master bedroom the moment Brandon's convoy disappeared. "Please, treat the house as your own. That's what you're paying for." The rental income was substantial, $8,000 for 2 weeks, with bookings solid through the summer season. Not only had I reclaimed my peace, but I'd turned my forced hospitality into a profitable business venture. Sometimes the universe has a delicious sense of irony. My quiet morning coffee ritual was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in an expensive suit holding what appeared to be legal documents. This should be interesting. "Ms. Sterling, I'm Rebecca Walsh from Walsh, Henderson & Associates. I represent your son Brandon Sterling in a property dispute matter." Of course he'd hired a lawyer. I should have expected this, though I was impressed he'd managed to scrape together legal fees, given his apparent cash flow problems. "What can I do for you, Ms. Walsh?" "My client believes there may have been some irregularities in the recent property transfer. He's concerned about elder abuse, specifically financial exploitation of a vulnerable family member." The audacity was breathtaking. Brandon was actually trying to claim I was mentally incompetent after I'd outmaneuvered his attempted takeover of my home. I had to admire the strategy, even as it infuriated me. "I see. And what exactly does your client consider irregular about a property owner making decisions about their own asset?" "Well, the sudden sale, the isolation of family members, the apparent confusion about property management." She consulted her notes. "My client is particularly concerned about the emotional distress you may be experiencing following your recent retirement. Major life transitions can affect judgment. Emotional distress. They were going to try to paint me as a confused old woman having a breakdown. The fact that Brandon knew me well enough to craft this narrative made it particularly insulting. "Ms. Walsh, I appreciate your concern, but I'm curious about something. Did your client mention the $15,000 catering bill he authorized at my property? Or perhaps his unauthorized communications with real estate agents claiming to represent me?" Her confident expression flickered. "I'm sure there are explanations." "Oh, I'm sure there are. In fact, I think this conversation would be much more productive if we involved my attorney. She specializes in elder law. Actually, particularly cases involving financial exploitation by adult children." The color drained from her face. In the legal world, elder financial abuse was serious business, and the evidence trail Brandon had left was extensive. Credit card charges, witness statements from the catering company, recorded phone calls with real estate agents. It would make a prosecutor's job remarkably easy. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss this matter more thoroughly. Perhaps we could. I'll have Sarah Chen's office contact you to schedule something appropriate. After she left, I called Sarah immediately. Eleanor, I was wondering when I'd hear from you about this. Brandon's lawyer called yesterday, fishing for information about your mental capacity. I told her that in 30 years of representing you, I'd never met a sharper businesswoman. He's really trying the incompetence angle? Classic desperate move. The problem is, you've got documentation for everything, witnesses to his behavior, and a paper trail that makes him look like he was systematically exploiting you. If he pushes this, it's going to backfire spectacularly. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that Brandon wouldn't give up this easily. He'd invested too much pride in his attempted power play to retreat gracefully. I was right to be concerned. What I didn't know was how far he was prepared to go. The first sign that Brandon was escalating came 3 days later when Mrs. Patterson approached me with obvious discomfort written across her face. Mrs. Sterling, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but a young man came by yesterday claiming to be your son. He seemed quite upset and wanted to know our rental rates and booking schedule. My blood chilled. Brandon was investigating my rental arrangements, which meant he was looking for angles to attack the property transfer. What did you tell him? Nothing, of course. It seemed inappropriate to discuss your business with someone we hadn't been introduced to, family or not. But he was quite persistent. He mentioned something about health concerns and your ability to manage such a large property. The manipulation was textbook Brandon. Plant seeds of doubt about my competence with my own tenants, hoping they'd report concerns to the property management company or local authorities. The strategy was clever and absolutely infuriating. Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate you handling that situation with discretion. If he returns, please don't hesitate to call the police. I haven't authorized anyone to inquire about my property management decisions. That evening, I received a call that confirmed my worst suspicions. Mom, we need to talk. Brandon's voice carried a smugness that set my teeth on edge. I've been doing some research into your recent decisions. Such as the fact that you're running an unlicensed bed and breakfast out of a residential property. Do you know what the zoning violations alone could cost you, and the liability issues if something happens to one of your tenants? The threat was clear. Comply with his demands or face regulatory harassment that could shut down my rental operation and potentially cost me the house. Interesting theory. Interesting. Brandon, did your research also discover that the property is properly zoned for short-term rental use and fully licensed through Dare County? Or that my insurance policy specifically covers vacation rental activities? The silence that followed was gratifying. Of course, I'd done my homework before setting up the rental operation. 30 years in business had taught me to anticipate every possible complication. You can't keep me away from my own family's property forever. It's not your family's property. It never was your family's property. It's my property, which I purchased with my money, and which I can dispose of however I choose. We'll see about that. The line went dead. But the threat lingered. Brandon was clearly building towards something bigger than legal challenges or zoning complaints. 2 days later, I discovered what. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the deck when a van pulled into my driveway. The logo on the side read, Coastal Elder Care Services, and the woman who emerged wore scrubs and carried a clipboard with official-looking forms. Mrs. Sterling? I'm Janet Torres, a social worker with Adult Protective Services. We've received a report of potential self-neglect and possible exploitation by caregivers. I need to conduct a welfare check. My son had called Adult Protective Services on me. He'd reported his own mother as a potentially abused elder in need of government intervention. The sheer viciousness of it took my breath away. Of course, I said calmly, though my hands were shaking with rage. Please come in. I assume you'll want to see the living conditions and speak with me privately? The inspection that followed was thorough and professional. Janet checked my refrigerator for adequate food, examined my medications for proper storage and dosing, assessed my personal hygiene and mental state, and reviewed my financial arrangements to ensure I wasn't being exploited. What she found was a well-maintained home, a clearly competent elderly woman, and rental documentation that demonstrated sound business judgment rather than exploitation. Mrs. Sterling, I have to ask about the person who filed this report. They claimed you were being isolated by caregivers and pressured into financial decisions you didn't understand. The person who filed this report is my son, who is angry that I refused to let him use my home as a free vacation rental for his extended family. When I declined his demands, he threatened to put me in a nursing home. Now, he's apparently decided to involve the government in our family dispute. Janet's expression hardened. Are you saying this report was filed maliciously? I'm saying this report was filed by someone who has repeatedly demonstrated that he views my independence as an inconvenience to be eliminated. After Janet left with assurances that the case would be closed as unfounded, I sat on my deck watching the Patterson family enjoy their peaceful vacation and realized that Brandon had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. The counteroffensive began with a single phone call to Mike Santos, the private investigator I'd used for corporate due diligence. If Brandon wanted to play hardball with government agencies and legal threats, I'd give him a lesson in why you never go to war with someone who has better resources and fewer scruples. Mike, remember that background check you ran on my house guests? I need you to go deeper. Full financial forensics, employment verification, legal history, everything. How deep are we talking, Eleanor? I want to know what they had for breakfast last Tuesday. These people have declared war on my independence, and I intend to win it decisively. The results arrived 2 days later in a thick manila envelope that revealed more than I'd bargained for. Brandon's graphic design business was 3 months behind on rent and facing eviction. Melissa had maxed out 4 credit cards funding their lifestyle, including the beach vacation at my house. Most interesting of all, they'd recently applied for a home equity loan against their house using projected inheritance from my estate as collateral. They'd been counting on my death or incapacitation to solve their financial problems. But the real bombshell came on page 12 of Mike's report. 6 months ago, Brandon had visited 3 different elder law attorneys, asking about conservatorship proceedings for an elderly parent with declining judgment. He'd been planning this takeover long before our confrontation about the beach house. The casual cruelty of it was staggering. While I'd been celebrating my retirement and looking forward to spending time with family, my own son had been researching how to have me declared incompetent so he could control my assets. I called Sarah Chen immediately. Sarah, I need you to prepare some documents. A restraining order application, elder abuse charges, and I want to explore filing a lawsuit for attempted financial exploitation. Eleanor, are you sure you want to escalate this far? Family court battles can get very ugly. He called Adult Protective Services on me, Sarah. He tried to have the government declare me incompetent based on lies. This stopped being a family dispute when he decided to destroy my reputation to get his hands on my money. That afternoon, while the Patterson family enjoyed their last few days of vacation, I implemented phase 2 of my strategy. I'd learned long ago that the best way to defeat an adversary was to remove their motivation for fighting. The first call was to Brandon's landlord, a commercial property manager I dealt with in my business days. A few strategic questions revealed that Brandon was indeed facing eviction and had been making increasingly desperate promises about upcoming family funds to buy time. The second call was to the credit card companies. As someone who'd spent years managing corporate finances, I knew exactly how to phrase concerns about potential fraud without making accusations I couldn't prove. By evening, Brandon's world was unraveling with the systematic precision of a controlled demolition. His phone call came at exactly 6:47 p.m. What did you do? His voice was raw with panic. I protected myself from further harassment by ensuring the relevant authorities have accurate information about your financial situation and recent activities. You destroyed my business, my credit, everything. I documented your behavior for legal proceedings. If your business and credit are destroyed, perhaps you should examine the choices that led to that outcome. You can't do this to family. You're absolutely right, Brandon. You can't do this to family. You can't threaten them, exploit them, or try to have them declared incompetent for your financial benefit. I'm glad we agree on that principle. The silence stretched until he spoke again, his voice smaller than I'd heard since he was a child. What do you want? Finally, the question I'd been waiting for. The moment when he realized he'd overplayed his hand and needed to negotiate rather than demand. I want you to disappear from my life, Brandon, permanently. No more phone calls, no more legal threats, no more showing up at my property or harassing my tenants. In exchange, I won't press charges for the Adult Protective Services fraud or the credit card expenses you can't afford. And if I don't agree, then we'll let a judge decide whether your behavior constitutes elder abuse. And you can explain to a courtroom why you thought threatening your mother with a nursing home was appropriate leverage for free vacation accommodation. I could hear him breathing on the other end, calculating odds and outcomes. I need time to think. You have 24 hours. After that, my attorney files the paperwork. And this becomes a public record that will follow you for the rest of your life. But as I hung up, I knew Brandon well enough to predict his next move. He wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. He'd try one final gambit, and when he did, I'd be ready. Brandon's final move came exactly 18 hours later, and it was more vicious than I'd anticipated. I discovered it when Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door, her face pale with distress. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm so sorry to bother you, but we've had some disturbing calls. Someone claiming to be your son has been contacting our employers, our neighbors, even our children's schools. He's telling people we're staying in an unsafe situation with an unstable elderly woman." The strategic brilliance of it was infuriating. Brandon couldn't attack me directly anymore without risking criminal charges, so he was attacking my tenants instead. If he could convince them to leave and spread word that my property was somehow dangerous, he could destroy my rental business and force me into the financial dependence he'd originally planned. What exactly is he telling people? That you're mentally ill, that you've been making irrational decisions, that we're in danger staying here. He even suggested we might be enabling elder abuse by paying rent to someone who's clearly incompetent. Mrs. Patterson handed me a notebook where she'd carefully documented the calls, including times, numbers, and the specific claims Brandon had made. The woman had inadvertently created a prosecutor's dream file of harassment evidence. "Mrs. Sterling, we don't want to get involved in family disputes, but this behavior is affecting our jobs, our children's schools. We may need to cut our vacation short." Of course they would. Brandon had calculated that normal people wouldn't tolerate having their lives disrupted by someone else's family drama. He was counting on them fleeing, leaving me isolated and financially damaged. But Brandon had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed I would react like a victim, instead of like the businesswoman who'd spent 30 years outmaneuvering corporate predators. I called Mike Santos first. "Mike, I need immediate documentation of harassment activities, phone records, social media posts, anything that shows a pattern of malicious conduct. I also need you to prepare a comprehensive report on the subject's financial motivations for this behavior." Next, I called Sarah Chen. "Sarah, file everything. Restraining order, elder abuse charges, harassment charges, and I want to explore both criminal and civil remedies. This ends now." But the call I was most looking forward to was the third one. "Brandon, we need to meet, in person, today. Mom, I think we should both cool down. We're meeting today or tomorrow. You're explaining to a judge why you've been harassing innocent families and interfering with legitimate business operations. Your choice." 2 hours later, Brandon sat across from me in the law offices of Sarah Chen, looking like a man who'd finally realized he was drowning. Gone was the smug confidence of the son who'd threatened me with nursing homes. This was a frightened, desperate person who'd gambled everything on a power play that had backfired catastrophically. "Before we begin," Sarah said, spreading documents across the conference table, "I want to make sure everyone understands the legal exposure we're discussing here." The papers painted a damning picture. Documentation of financial exploitation attempts, evidence of harassment, records of false reports to government agencies, witness statements from multiple parties. Any prosecutor would salivate over a case this well documented. "Brandon," I said quietly, "I want you to understand something. 6 months ago, when you started researching conservatorship proceedings, you made a choice. You decided to treat your mother as an obstacle rather than as family. Everything that's happened since then has been the consequence of that choice." His face went white. "How did you—" "I know about the attorney consultations. I know about using my projected inheritance as collateral for loans you can't afford. I know about all of it." Sarah slid another document across the table. "This is a comprehensive financial audit of your family's situation over the past year. The pattern of expenditures, the assumption of inheritance, the timing of your mother's property conflicts, it tells a very clear story about motive. Brandon stared at the papers like they were a death sentence. In many ways, they were. "What do you want?" he whispered. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes for the first time in months. "I want the truth, Brandon. All of it. When did you start planning to take control of my finances? When did you decide I was more valuable to you incapacitated than independent? And most importantly, did you ever love me as a mother, or have I always just been a retirement plan to you?" The silence that followed would determine whether my son and I had any relationship worth saving. His answer would change everything. Brandon's hands shook as he reached for the water glass Sarah had placed in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "It started after Dad died. My ex-husband had passed 3 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving Brandon his sole male role model, and apparently some twisted ideas about family responsibility. Dad always said you were too independent for your own good, that women your age needed guidance, structure. When he died, he made me promise to take care of you when the time came." The words hit like physical blows. Harold, my controlling ex-husband, had been manipulating our son from beyond the grave. "When you sold the company for all that money, I panicked. I thought you'd make stupid decisions, get taken advantage of. The beach house seemed like such a waste. All that space for one person. So you decided to take over. I decided to provide guidance." His voice cracked with desperation. "Just like Dad said I should. But you wouldn't listen. You acted like I was trying to steal from you instead of protect you." Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see the disgust in her eyes. She'd seen this pattern before. Adult children who convinced themselves that exploitation was protection. "Brandon, when did protecting me become taking over my house and threatening me with nursing homes? When you wouldn't be reasonable." The mask slipped completely now, revealing the entitled anger underneath. "You had this huge house you didn't need, money you couldn't possibly spend, and you were just wasting it, sitting there alone instead of sharing with family. Sharing with family? Or providing free vacation accommodation for your in-laws while you used my property for business networking." He flinched but pressed on. "Everything I did was for the family. The connections I was making, the business opportunities, that would have benefited everyone eventually. Including the part where you researched having me declared incompetent?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Brandon's face cycled through denial, defiance, and finally, defeated acceptance. "The lawyers said it was the only way to protect you from yourself, that someone your age shouldn't be making major financial decisions alone." Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Sterling, did any of these lawyers suggest that your mother showed signs of actual cognitive decline? Or were you shopping for legal opinions that matched your desired outcome?" The silence was answer enough. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the whole pathetic spectacle. This was my son, the child I'd worked 2 jobs to support, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose failures I'd funded repeatedly, and he'd been planning to destroy my independence for his own benefit while convincing himself it was for my protection. "Sarah, proceed with all legal remedies. I want restraining orders, I want harassment charges filed, and I want a comprehensive legal barrier between this person and my life." "Mom, wait. You're not my son anymore, Brandon. Sons don't research having their mothers declared incompetent. Sons don't threaten nursing homes when they don't get their way. Sons don't call government agencies to report their own parents as abuse victims." I turned to face him one final time. "You want to know the ironic part? If you'd simply asked to visit the beach house occasionally, I would have said yes. If you'd been respectful, grateful, kind, I would have shared everything with you eventually. But you couldn't wait for generosity. You had to take control." His face crumpled. "I can change. We can fix this." "No, we can't. Trust, once broken this completely, can't be repaired. You've shown me who you really are, and I believe you." I walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Brandon? That $15,000 catering bill you authorized? I've decided not to pay it. Since you publicly claimed management authority over the property, the catering company will be pursuing you for payment. I'm sure your lawyer can explain your legal exposure for unauthorized contracts." 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation from the Patterson family. Their oldest daughter was getting married, and they'd asked if they could hold the ceremony at that beautiful beach house where we had such a peaceful vacation. The rental income from wedding events, it turned out, was even more lucrative than vacation bookings. Brandon sent one final letter through his attorney, a formal apology that requested visitation rights and suggested family counseling. I had Sarah respond with a simple statement: "Ms. Sterling has moved on with her life and wishes you well in yours." Because that's exactly what I'd done. I'd moved on to a life where my independence was respected. My decisions were my own, and family meant people who loved me rather than people who wanted to control me. Some days, sitting on my deck watching the sunrise over the Atlantic, I felt a twinge of sadness for the son I'd lost. But mostly, I felt gratitude for the life I'd saved. My own. The beach house became everything I dreamed it would be. A place of peace, beauty, and genuine hospitality. Just not for the family I'd originally intended to share it with. Sometimes the best family is the one you choose rather than the one you're born with. And sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone else's worst impulses, even when that someone is your own child. Especially when that someone is your own child. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.